New York's classic rock, Q1043.
Welcome back, Ron Chaluisan. He is the executive director of the Newark Trust for Education. And first of all, what is happening within classroom in Newark? What is the situation?
Sure. So the students in Newark are still on remote learning, full remote learning. There is a desire for students to go back, and there's a timeline that takes them back in April. And so we're going to see how that plays out. Obviously, looking at the various conditions, the spread within the community, looking at the vaccination and the vaccination take up, just making sure that all of the conditions in the school buildings themselves are good. But the idea is that they would get back in April.
What are you finding with how this has been now that it's a year of remote education? What is working? What is not working?
I think that with all of us, there is certainly a sense of tedium, possibly, right? The notion of getting onto the computer for extended periods of time, kind of the types of social actions that involves. I think students, I think sometimes we forget that kids are, 9, 10, 11, 13 years old, and it's hard. I think it's wearing down on many of them, this kind of interaction. And I think they have some amazing teachers who have been working very diligently to try to figure out different ways to engage them in this medium. But again, we're social beings. We like to interact. We like physical proximity. And I think I talk to my adult friends and we hear that all of the time. And in the conversation of getting back to school, I think there's a desire for that to occur. I think the immediate situation is that we need to think about how kids are interacting today in real moment and really think about how their school day is structured and make sure that we're attending to right now, not just thinking in the future.
Is there any certain age group that is hit hardest in terms of this lack of social interaction for a year?
I think every single age group is hit. I wouldn't hazard to guess the scientific answer to that one. I'm just thinking about all of the years that I've spent in schools and with kids and have had the opportunity to travel to different countries. And one of the things that has always been amazing to me, Shelley, is that I spend time in Colombia, I've spent time in Italy, I've spent time in Puerto Rico, and you look at kids, and no matter where you are, the same things happen. You just look at a school building, you look at a campus, and you see the kids in groups, you see them laughing, you see them hugging, you see them touching, and whether that's high school students or second grade students, you see that same kind of interaction. And I just have to imagine that right now, with the limited numbers of interactions, all of the kids are having different types of issues. I think the older kids, by no way a substitute, but the older kids probably have some social networks that they have, built over time. They do use digital media more extensively probably than younger students for socialization. And so they may have some outlets, but I know that students 15, 16, 17-year-olds have spoken that it's not a substitute, right? It is not a substitute. They're very clear that it is augmenting their physical relationships, but it is not a substitute for them. So yeah, I would think all of them, I would say, are struggling with this.
Are there any subjects, school subjects, where kids are struggling more than as opposed to others, like history versus
Yeah.
math, for example?
Yeah. So it's interesting. I think that the places where technology potentially have solutions might be places also that kids struggle somewhat, right? And I think that's more about um, our disposition somewhat as Americans. I think math is a subject which I started my career as a math teacher, and both as a math teacher and when I was a principal, I remember very clearly outlawing the statement that I am not a math person. We're very comfortable as Americans saying I am not a math person. And it's always been odd to me because we require students to study math throughout their P12 career. They're tested in math every single year. We have very specific requirements about what they're supposed to know. And then, it is okay for teachers and adults to say to a child, oh, I can't help you with the algebra homework because I'm not a math person. And so it's just a very mixed message in my mind. And I think we don't practice mathematical or algebraic thinking explicitly. I think we do, quite honestly, think that way. There are lots of examples where we're looking at, for example, change in rate, differences in rate. We're looking at geometric relationships, but we don't talk about it that way. And so kids don't get the kind of practice on a day-to-day basis in those concepts, nor do they necessarily get the positive type of reinforcement that you would get if you were doing that kind of work every day. It's inconceivable in many minds to say, I don't read. Right? It's just not something that's acceptable. And quite honestly, for people who have struggled in the past, there's some shame and there's some stigma attached with that. And so kids, I think our messaging around reading has been very, very positive and intense. That kids should read independently. They should have books around, that homes it should be print rich. So I would tend to think that the reading type of assignments, that kind of ongoing work in literacy, probably has suffered less than the math development that they would have. And then I know in Newark, for example, Newark is is a historical city, right? There's a strong sense of history in Newark. We have a city historian, Junius Williams, and there are lots of discussions about the Great Migration and what's occurred and how important it is to know your past. And so not that you're going to get the same level of systematic study in that area, but I do think that there's a more general discussion that allows kids to continue in that vein. So, I think we're going to see a disproportionate kind of growth depending on the particular subject area that we're talking about.
I am speaking with the executive director of Newark Trust for Education, Ron Chaluisan. And you raise an interesting thing with math. I forget where I had read this, but I read the most important teacher perhaps in all of your education is the one who teaches you algebra. Because if you understand algebra, then you will understand math. You will be able to breeze through. People like me, in school was a nightmare for me because of math. I never got it. I'm one of those people who say I'm not a math person, but as you know, in later years, I've come to learn, well, maybe I just wasn't taught properly. So what can be done? In my mind, that's the issue. What are we doing wrong in teaching math? How do we get this right?
Do you have a few days? Because I have a lot of opinions on this topic. I had the privilege of teaching 14 and 15-year-olds algebra. As I said, I started my career there. And one thing that was formative for me was I actually had started off thinking I was a science major when I went to college, and I switched out of science. I did the biology, I did calculus, I did all of those things, and then switched out and ended up being an English major. So when I started to teach high school, even though my degree was in English, they gave me an emergency credential to teach math because I had all the math credits on my transcript. I did teach English and math to the same group of students, which I think was just the most amazing entry into teaching, because what it allowed me to do was to see kids' strengths in the two different areas, the two major areas that they're normally assessed on. And what dawned on me was that algebra, when you think about algebra, what is it that you're being asked to do? You're basically being asked to create abstractions from concrete, right? You're going from a concrete way of thinking to an abstract way of thinking. And in essence, you have a whole bunch of different pieces that you need to put together in a way that makes sense. Well, what's English and what's writing and what's logic? English, writing, and logic is exactly the same thing. You're asking students to create reliable relationships between different concepts and to be able to articulate that. And I think if you really approach it from that sense of how am I taking these different pieces, what's the relationship between these different things, what are true relationships and how do I articulate them, you get to a place with kids where it makes sense to them. It's not just these letters and these signs and right. It's a challenge. It's I have these 5 things and I know there's a relationship between and among these 5 things. I just got to figure out what that relationship is. So I think it could be really exciting. I think you see lots of examples in day-to-day life that you could use that help kids to start to see what those relationships are.
Okay, what would those be?
Sure. So I started by saying, the classic thing, right? You think about one of your most classic algebraic problem, right? A train starts at point A and goes this distance that way and that, right? Well, so it's interesting. What are you really asking? You're asking kids, if you think about just their day-to-day, you're asking kids, where could you potentially, how do you figure out if people are doing things in different ways, different mechanisms, it's taking them different amounts of time. How do you start to figure out what those, if this group is doing that in another group, how do you get to a place where those groups actually are completing the same tasks? And what's the relationship between how long it takes to complete those tasks? Is this guy going to take twice as long? Is that guy going to take first, right? And they see it. They see things like in basketball. You have 2 teams and they're kind of trying to achieve different objectives across each other. They start to understand that it is a relationship, right? It's not something that you grab out of thin air. That it means something. I'm now, of course, I'm stuck on a better example, but I do know I can do it the other way. For example, if you think about English and you think about people teaching conjunctions, right? And, or, nor, but, right? This and this, right? This is this versus this is not this, or this is greater than that. All of those things make sense to kids. What doesn't make sense is n is greater than or equal to 2 times x plus 1, right?
Yeah, that's where that was it for me. That was it for me. Yeah. I would never be able to, wrap my head around that.
Right. And not to get too nerdy on this, but if you think about that, right? So this player can run twice as fast as that player, right? If you give them a 10-second head start, right? That's what n equals 2x plus 10 means, right? And it's just getting kids to break that it's not just these symbols, that the symbols mean something, and then they can move forward. And going back to the topic we were talking about, think about dinner tables. Think about just interactions in your home. Think about interactions with your friends. You never talk that way. You never point out those relationships, right? It's very rare that you would say, oh, you're thinking algebraically, right? But you would sometimes correct if the conjunction is incorrect. You would say, wait, that doesn't make sense to me. That relationship is off.
Ron, we only have about another minute left. What do you want to cover here that we have not talked about?
Well, I think that the big piece here on kids going back to school is that we have very different priorities happening right now. We have priorities that are talking about lowering infection rates, lowering hospital rates. We have priorities talking about going back to work. We have priorities about kids learning. And I think what ends up happening is that we mix up those priorities in each discussion. I think the basic point here is I believe very strongly everyone wants children to go back to school, and the conditions to make that occur, we have control over many of the conditions that help us to make that occur. And we just have, if that's our primary goal, we have to stay focused on that. Mitigation, lowering community rates, and making sure that kids are safe within the building. that needs to be the priority, and we'll get our kids back to school.
As my grandmother would say, from your mouth to God's ear. Thank you so much, Ron Chaluisan. He is the executive director of Newark Trust for Education. And coming up next, we're going to be talking to Mrs. New Jersey. I didn't even know till recently there was a Mrs. New Jersey, but she's doing a lot of good, and we'll check in with her next. Q104.3.
New York's classic rock. Q1043.